Hi Fraser, how are you doing?
The usual introduction.
How's it shaping up? Now we're in April.
It's good. It's good. I was just sort of reflecting on what's been of interest over since we did our last podcast. In fact, in our discussion before this, you brought up the fact that the UK grid had one of its lowest carbon days.
That's right. So the headline I saw was I think it was UK has highest green energy levels ever due to a combination of sunny weather, sunny skies, and also a strong wind.
Yes, and we saw that with our clients, with some of the data that we were collecting, and client, we do a lot of our work with people with grid constraints, and so there were a number of our control systems kicking in as wind and solar both work together to basically produce more energy than normal. But yeah, the grid got down to I think about 39 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. Now,
Right.
just to put that in perspective, over the whole year, the UK grid has an average at the moment has an average carbon dioxide intensity of about 220 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So
Right.
essentially, it was a sort of an 80% reduction on the average for the year, and it sort of kind of shows what we've actually already got invested out there on the grid already.
I mean, that's an incredible statistic. It wasn't that long ago that you had the sort of naysayers saying that wind and solar just were never going to be an option. But then, and of course, there's a way to go yet. But having a statistic like that is a signpost to the future, is it not?
It is. I mean, just going back to that kind of naysaying. I mean, solar, has now dropped in price. The price is now per kilowatt peak invested about 80 or 90% below where it was in say 2010. So in 10 years, we've had a massive drop in the price of solar. Wind, to an extent, was further along the curve and hasn't seen such massive price drops, but was already economic to a large extent. Uh, but prices have come down there as well. So what we now have are technologies, wind and solar predominantly, that do not actually need subsidies from the government to make them work.
Right.
So when we're this particular day where we saw significant production of wind and solar, shows you actually the volume of investment that's gone on over the last 10 years plus into these technologies. But what it doesn't necessarily bring to light is the challenge of keeping that consistent for the 8,700 odd hours of the year. Obviously, we talk about this word intermittency with renewables,
Yeah.
and intermittency, basically means that it happens at irregular times. To some extent, we can predict when we can say when the sun's going to come out, but we can't necessarily predict to what intensity, because that's all dependent on the cloud cover and the weather. And the same with wind. The Met Office and people like that do a very good job at kind of predicting the amount of wind that we might have, but again, it's just a prediction. So this kind of intermittency of wind and solar makes the challenge of moving this 1 hour or this one small period for one day through to an entire year a real challenge. And I think in reality, and we've been saying this for a long time, the only way that you mitigate that intermittency is through energy storage. So it's how, when you have those massive bursts of energy from low carbon renewable sources, you don't want there to be an excess of energy generated, because that causes the grid just as much of a problem as when there's not so much energy generated. So to try and sort of create the profile that meets all of the sort of domestic and commercial needs in the country, we need storage to be able to take that on in the excess periods, store it, and then send it back in the periods when there's not as much. That wonderful piece of news on that one day, which is great and gives us a kind of a great headline and a direction, belies the kind of challenge that we face in the kind of infrastructure and investment that is required going forward to achieve this kind of zero carbon infrastructure that we're talking about. And I think the other thing, not that I'm trying to suddenly turn into a negative on this, is there's been a lot of talk about electric vehicles. And so if we're putting electric vehicles onto the grid, which then suddenly adds a significant amount of demand to the existing demand, electrical demand, then actually, that day where we see, a significant proportion of our energy generated by existing infrastructure in wind and solar, suddenly that's got to be a factor greater again, potentially to kind of mitigate against those excess periods of charging from cars, which are typically going to be done at night when there's no solar, and or there may or may not be any wind. So how do we meet those periods with a level of non-intermittency, or sort of meeting that profile? So there are real challenges.
Where are we on the journey of storage then? I mean, how's that shaping up?
Well, I think storage is making huge leaps. I mean, just going back to what we're seeing in large scale in front of meter installation. So in front of meter means it's on the grid side, it's on the distribution and transmission side. It's not on a commercial site or a domestic site. It's actually embedded within the system, and we're seeing a very large number of 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatt solar and storage projects going through, because as I said at the start, the economics of solar and to some extent storage now, with the market mechanisms that National Grid and people like that have put in place to try and incentivize this balancing that we need at times of stress, are starting to make sense. And there are some stories, where these batteries are making very, very large returns, because the balancing requirement is starting to become so acute that they are getting paid a lot of money at these periods of stress.
So the generation part is really very, very much just half the story, because I think what you're saying, if my understanding is right, is that generation is one thing, but it's the stress on the grid. So if there's too much being generated at one point, actually what you really need is to flatten that out, or indeed, as you said, I think get people to use almost a sort of energy dump, to actually use energy to take the stress off the grid. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean that's when when we start to have signals to electric vehicles. You should be charging now, because
Right. Okay.
either A, there's excess, probably not there's excess energy. It would probably be more of a financial signal that would say,
Right.
hey, listen, you can charge your car at 1 pence a kilowatt hour for free right now.
So there's really smart ways of dumping energy in that case. It's not just a question of like, oh my lord, we've got too much, let's turn on all the lights and waste it. It's more a case of, right now now's the opportunity for people to charge their cars up, for example, as you say, for free.
Yeah, and I think this is what we mean when we talk about the smart grid.
Right.
It's sort of machines taking some of those decisions away that we want to be taken away, that we don't actually need to make. I don't need somebody to call me up and say, would you like to charge your car at 1 pence?
Right.
I can set that I'm happy to charge between 1 and 6 pence, anytime it wants me to, as long as I'm connected. But it doesn't then need a machine to sort of send me a text and say, are you happy for me to do this? I just set the boundaries, and it can just move ahead and do that. And so I think it's when we talk about smart grid, I really think that there's a lot of kind of negative press out there about the smart grid, and some of that is, I would say, appropriate.
Uh-huh.
When we start talking about putting sensors in kettles and sensors in this kind of Internet of Things, where
Yeah.
everything's intelligent, everything's smart. When you're 2 minutes away from your home, you can send a text, and your kettle can switch on, so you've got that hot cup of tea when you get home. I mean, this is where we're sort of losing the plot potentially when we talk about smart. I find it really funny when you walk into houses and or you see these houses, and people clap, and the lights go on, or they say, Alexa, turn on the lights, and it's kind of like, What are we turning into when we can't actually flick a switch, to turn the
Mm.
lights on and off, and we're relying on all of this technology that we actually don't understand a lot of the time. So I'm really sort of focused on the fact that smart should be, smart in the fact that it's removing appropriate stress from people in terms of what they need, what they need to pay attention to and do. I think we're all very capable of switching on the kettle when we get home, flicking a switch to switch the lights on. So yeah, I think we need to be appropriate in our approach to smart, and certainly I would say that from the storage perspective, smart is appropriate, because what we need storage to be able to do is to say, I think I know what the solar is going to do over the next 24 hours. I think I know what the demand profile will be like. I think I know there's going to be an electric car connected. I think I know what the price is going to be over that time period. I think I know what these different physical constraints are going to be as well. So therefore, I'm going to undertake these actions to try and balance out all of those, and to achieve the best energy, carbon, and financial outcome in each, in that scenario. And I think that's appropriately smart. And I certainly don't want to stand there and sort of flick a switch to tell my battery to go on and off at
Yeah.
different times. I may want the opportunity to be able to change the boundaries within which it works, but I'd rather it just worked as an autonomous piece of technology that then reports back to me what it's actually done, and also where it's gone wrong, because prediction's not 100% right, and it can go horrendously wrong, and it can be amazingly right. So it's then that kind of iterative process of trying to understand what's working and what's not.
Yeah. So going back to that word smart, I mean, smart, we just need to remember what the definition of smart is, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have been impacted by technology to such an extent just in the last 10 years. I mean, let
Mm.
alone the last 20 years. I mean, when I started work, there was no email. This is what, 1994, my first job. No email. I had no mobile. I had to write a letter, or I had to call somebody, my gosh, on a landline, and
Yeah.
actually meet up at a place. I remember, my girlfriend partner now, Katie, we had to arrange on the phone where to meet in Covent
Yeah.
Garden or wherever it was.
Sure.
And and if she wasn't there or I wasn't there was no way of getting in touch with each other.
The thing was that you probably were there because, likewise,
You had to be.
yeah, exactly. So there was no way of telling
Yeah,
somebody that you were running late or you couldn't make it. So you actually just did it. You didn't stand people up, did you?
that was it. Yeah, or you made sure that somebody else was there if there really was a case where you couldn't get there. But it was, so we've let technology impact us in huge ways that we're only sort of starting to come to terms with now. And we all know about the positives and the negatives of technology, and I think we need to sort of learn from those experiences about how we want technology really to really impact us in the field of, obviously we're just talking about energy,
Yeah.
and to make sure that what we do, A, isn't out of our control where it doesn't need to be out of our control, and B, we kind of, the stuff that we can control, we understand. I think we've got a world of consumers and producers in terms of technology. And if you're a consumer of technology, you use Word, you use Excel, you use a website. Most people that do that have no clue really how it's
Mm.
working, what's going on behind it. And I think we probably all need to start becoming a bit more savvy, because otherwise I think we can sort of start to lose a sort of a grip on where we're going, and what we want.
We all need a Raspberry Pi.
Oh, don't get me started on Raspberry Pis.
Well, have you
I
got
think
one?
Raspberry Pis are great. They're such powerful machines now. I'm a big fan of the Raspberry Pi.
Nice. Well, I think I might ask for a Raspberry Pi for Christmas.
I was actually inspired by another podcast this week. I was listening to a friend of mine, Tom Rivett Karnak. He's with Christiana Figueres and Outrage and Optimism, and Paul Dickinson. Sorry, who the three of them have a great podcast. They're producing really high quality sort of stuff about really about climate and energy and stuff like that. And one of the things that I thought was interesting also that Paul Dickinson brought up, just talking about this kind of move to zero carbon and things like that. was in relation to the fact that we've had what we've got to realize with vehicle businesses is they have a massive lobby group behind them. So when we vote with our money, really, and we buy a diesel car or a petrol car, part of that money is going into lobbying groups that then lobby politicians to continue to support the fossil fuel transport business.
Yeah.
And what's interesting now is suddenly, I don't know whether you saw, but Volkswagen announced that they are only going to make electric vehicles.
Right. Yeah, I did see that.
That's really interesting, he was saying, because now what you've got is you suddenly got this kind of double whammy going the other way, where when we start to vote with our money again and we start to buy electric vehicles, or you have vehicle manufacturers starting to push for electric vehicles, suddenly the lobbying goes the other way. And we're going to start to see a kind of a double whammy moving in the right direction, potentially, of incentivizing the infrastructure required for electric vehicles. So although it may seem quite slow at the moment in terms of kind of the transition to electric vehicles, and they're so expensive. I mean, how can anybody afford them? What we're not seeing behind the scenes is as these companies start to sort of shift quite dramatically towards electric, that actually also behind that is a political shift from the lobbying that will kind of add jet fuel to, probably the wrong analogy, but add a real sort of kicker to the momentum in that direction. And I thought that was sort of quite interesting. The International Energy Agency said that over 2020, global emissions of carbon dioxide were only down 6%. Now, we need to see emissions reduced by 6% or 7% a year every year for the next 20, 30 years.
Wow.
Now, if it takes a kind of pandemic on a global scale to kind of only reduce emissions by 6%, because, I mean, in a way, what's happened is, okay, we haven't traveled, but air emissions are only about 3% of total emissions, right? So that's fairly small. But what we've done is we've moved all of our energy consumption from the office to our homes. Yeah. So if we're going to solve this thing called climate change, and we need the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions that we keep talking about, then it's not going to come about from behavior change, working from home, not kind of, I mean, the last year has kind of proved that, right? It's only going to happen through serious technological changes in the things that we use. And that means that we need, cars to stop using fossil fuels. We need our energy generation to stop using fossil fuels. We need to stop, all of our heating systems to move from gas to something like hydrogen or whatever it might be. But we need to radically change the technology that's delivering that power and heat to ourselves.
Behavior is not enough. It's not going to cut the mustard.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the efficiency paradox. It's got a more specific name, but where the more efficient we become, actually, the more energy we use, because we go, I put energy efficient lights in. I can have these on for longer.
Sure.
And there's a sort of negative return on investment almost with energy efficiency, and so you need to just make sure that the thing that's whether you've gone efficient or not, the thing that's coming in and delivering to that efficient bit of technology just isn't based on fossil fuels. If we're going to get to this zero carbon, and I think that is the challenge, and that's why I reiterate it. We have to get the Volkswagens of the world talking about electric. We have to get the Shells and the BPs saying we ain't going to do fossil fuels anymore. It has to come from the kind of that sort of radical shift in the delivery of our lifestyles through with non-fossil fuel based power.
And what about us as individuals? What's our sort of moral responsibility here?
Well, moral responsibility. Now you're going to get me started on rights and responsibilities. What's our moral? Well, somebody said to me today, a good friend of mine, Bob Luck, he said, our only right is to act responsibly. Our only right is to act responsibly. Now, when he said that, I just sort of thought, actually, that this is something I think we just need to sort of delve into more deeply. Maybe not on this podcast, but
Sure.
it's we always talk about rights. It's my right to do this. It's my right to have that. It's my right for this. What you very, very rarely hear in the conversation is people talking about responsibilities.
Sure.
And so I think we need to start a new conversation about responsibilities. That if it's our right to have clean air, if it's our right to have a planet that we can live on appropriately and in balance, we need to talk about responsibilities. And this also sits alongside, not activism is the wrong thing, but when we go out, I've been on the student marches and things like this, and it's great. My kids are involved. I absolutely passionately believe in it. But we also have to have a line with, we want this, we need that, boom, boom, boom. It's kind of like we also need and our responsibility will be this, and our responsibility will be that. The one thing we're trying this Easter is a public transport week. We live in Devon, right? And so everybody's on a staycation this year. Nobody's going abroad. Everybody's talking about Devon and Cornwall being absolutely rammed. And there's me sitting in my home going, oh, God, I can't believe all these people that come to Devon, blah, 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 all in their cars, blocking up our roads, And then I sort of turn around and go, well, just a second, I'm doing exactly the same thing. I get out and I drive in my car and I block up the same roads.
Yeah.
And so we are going to try and think about our responsibility in that sense to not get in our car as often. So we're still looking at, okay, right, how can we get to Dartmouth by bus? How can we go to Salcombe by bus? What about a train trip just down into, the edge of Cornwall? Or how can we get onto Dartmoor by bus and then walk and get back? Because I think we need to experience it. We need to to kind of respond in this responsible way and try it, and also learn what's not working with it, so that we can then communicate that to our local politicians or our local communities or whatever it might be. But we need to sort of act in lots and lots of different ways. Yeah, well, I'll let you know how it goes in the next podcast. I'm going to make one final point, because I know we've been talking for a long time, but when we hear the government, Rishi Sunak and whoever talk about, in his budget, and we talked about this last time, and maybe I'm repeating what I've already said, but it's still sticking with me. It's all about innovation. It's all about funding innovation. It's about, we're putting X number of billions into this bit of innovation. What we've got to realize is all of the solutions are already with us.
Right.
We've just got to do it.
Yep.
The solar technology, the wind technology, to an extent, storage technology, putting public transport is with us. We've just got to make it more accessible. All of these things, the technology is here. We don't need to innovate necessarily significantly. We just need to implement it properly.
This is a How production. Please follow this podcast and share.